By the 1760s, Boston had become one of the most important cities in British North America, a crowded port shaped by trade, power, and rising tension. Within a generation, the city would be driven through revolution, scarred by conflict, and rebuilt as part of a new nation. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, maps, and engravings to life, shifting perspective, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original artists never could. The goal isn't just to look at the past, but to step into it, to move through Boston as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to stand here, from settlement to revolution. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot in Old Boston, it helps to look at how this story began. This painting depicts the arrival of the Winthrop fleet in New England in 1630. Led by John Winthrop, these ships carried settlers to the Massachusetts Bay, laying the groundwork for what would soon become Boston. Imagine arriving on this unfamiliar stretch of coastline, stepping ashore without knowing what lay ahead, only that everything you hoped to build would begin here. Just before we move into the 18th century, I want to pause here for a moment. This image shows Boston's first meeting house, originally built in 1632, only a few years after the settlement was founded. The engraving itself was made much later, but it likely reflects how the building would have appeared, simple, functional, and central to everyday life. The meeting house stood near today's State Street, close to the heart of modern downtown Boston, marking how closely the city's earliest foundations still align with its present layout. On the path toward the 18th century, it's worth stopping briefly to look at scenes like this. A Boston still quiet, uncertain, and only beginning to take shape. This image is not a contemporary drawing, but it captures the character of a much smaller colonial town, long before the dense streets and busy harbour of the 1700s. Modest wooden buildings line muddy roads, with ships anchored close to shore and daily life unfolding at a slower, more fragile pace. Scenes like this help ground us in a time when Boston was less a city and more an experiment, still finding its footing in a new world. If I could visit this place with what I know today, I think I'd see it as one of the earliest roots of what would later be called the American dream. This engraving dates to the early 1720s and shows the city as it appeared from the harbour, already recognizable in key ways today. In the foreground is Boston Harbour, crowded with ships that powered the city's Atlantic economy. No longer a fragile settlement, but a growing port town whose streets, harbour, and skyline still shape the city we know now. To better show Long Wharf, I've added this 1743 engraving, which makes its scale and importance easier to see. Here, Long Wharf extends prominently into the harbour near the centre of the view, projecting farther into the water than the surrounding docks and piers, and serving as one of Boston's primary gateways to the Atlantic world. From this point, ships arriving from Europe and the Caribbean unloaded cargo, passengers stepped ashore, and Boston made its first impression on those approaching by sea. A defining waterfront landmark whose position and outline can still be traced and visited in the city today. Rising behind it are church steeples marking the town's neighbourhoods, including Christ Church in the North End, later known as Old North Church, which still stands today. Seen together, these landmarks show Boston on the threshold of transformation, no longer a fragile settlement, but a growing port town whose streets, harbour, and skyline still shape the city we know now. This image shows Boston Light, the first lighthouse built in what would become the United States. Completed in 1716 on Little Brewster Island, at the entrance to Boston Harbour. For arriving ships, it was often the first sign of land after a long Atlantic crossing. Imagine finally seeing this light after weeks or even months at sea, a signal that the journey was ending and that the promise of new opportunity was finally within reach. During the Revolutionary War, the original structure was deliberately destroyed by British forces in 1776 as they withdrew from Boston, but it was rebuilt just a few years later in 1783, and remarkably, Boston Lights still stands on the same site today, continuing to guide vessels into the harbour more than 3 centuries on. This engraving shows Castle William, the main fort guarding the entrance to Boston Harbour in the early 18th century. Positioned on Castle Island, it controlled the narrow approaches to the town and symbolized British military authority in the colony. For ships entering the harbor, its guns were a reminder that Boston was not just a port of opportunity, but a place watched, defended, and firmly tied to imperial power. Leaving the sea, we step onto land just across the river in Cambridge, a town already closely tied to Boston's life and future. At this time, this was Harvard College, a small but important center of learning in colonial New England. Long before it became a global university, Harvard existed to train clergy and civic leaders for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In this view, 3 early buildings define the college yard. On the left stands Harvard Hall, used for classes and daily instruction. At the center is Stoughton Hall, built as student housing as the college slowly expanded. And on the right is Massachusetts Hall, completed in 1720 and still standing today, the oldest surviving building at Harvard. Knowing what we know now, it's strange to think how ordinary this place must have felt at the time. Sitting here, looking around, feeling the people, it's easy to imagine walking these grounds without knowing what the future would hold, only that something important was beginning to brew. This image shows the old State House in Boston around the mid-18th century. One of the most important public buildings in the town at the time. It served as the seat of colonial government, where laws were debated, taxes imposed, and royal authority was enforced in the years leading up to the Revolution. From this very building, proclamations were read aloud to crowds gathered below, and it stood at the center of Boston's civic life. Today, it still stands in the heart of the city, a rare survivor from this era, quietly witnessing how the streets around it would soon become a stage for history. This scene shows Boston Common in the late 1760s, one of the oldest public spaces in the city. At the time, it was a shared ground, used for grazing animals, public gatherings, military drills, and everyday leisure. British soldiers often trained here, sometimes within sight of townspeople going about their lives. A quiet but constant reminder of imperial presence. In the background stands the Province House, the official residence of the royal governors of Massachusetts, overlooking the Common as a symbol of British authority. Today, this space is still known as Boston Common, now a public park at the heart of the city. But in the years before the Revolution, it was a place where ordinary life and growing tension existed side by side. Standing here now, I can't help but picture what it must have been like. People crossing the Common, kids running around, soldiers drilling nearby, all of it part of everyday life. At the time, it probably felt like just another ordinary day, without any sense that within a decade, this would become part of an independent country. I can't be in Boston on the edge of revolution and not stop here. This scene shows the events of December 1773, when colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped chests of tea into the water in protest of British taxation. Some of the men disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, partly to conceal their identities, and partly to frame the act as something distinctly American rather than British. At the time, it wasn't called the Boston Tea Party. It was a deliberate act meant to send a message, not create a spectacle. Just a decision carried out in the cold harbor that pushed Boston one step closer to open resistance. This is the Green Dragon Tavern, one of the most famous gathering places in pre-revolutionary Boston. By the 1760s and early 1770s, it was far more than a place to drink. It served as an informal headquarters where merchants, craftsmen, dock workers, and political organizers gathered to debate British policies and coordinate resistance. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty are known to have met here, using its private rooms to plan protests, share intelligence, and organize responses to events like new taxes. In spaces like this, the revolution didn't begin with speeches or declarations, but with conversations, shaped by anger, uncertainty, and a growing sense that the old order was no longer working. This is Faneuil Hall in 1775, often called the Cradle of Liberty. By this point, the building was already well established as Boston's central meeting place, a market on the ground floor, and above it, a hall where town meetings, debates, and protests unfolded. It was here that Bostonians gathered to argue over taxes, representation, and the growing presence of British authority, sometimes packing the room shoulder to shoulder as tensions rose. By the eve of the revolution, Faneuil Hall had become a place where public opinion was shaped in the open, where speeches turned frustration into action, and where the idea of resistance moved from private conversations into the streets outside. The building still stands today, but in moments like this, it was less a landmark and more a pressure point. A space where a city wrestled with what it was about to become. This image shows a triumphal arch erected in Boston in 1789 to welcome George Washington as president of a newly independent nation. The arch itself was temporary, built just for this occasion, but what it symbolized was lasting. Though constructed of wood, it was carefully finished to resemble stone, giving it the appearance of permanence at a moment when the nation itself was still new. Only a few years earlier, these streets had been filled with protest and uncertainty. Now they were dressed for celebration. For the people standing here, this wasn't just a visit, it was proof that the revolution had led somewhere. The colonies were no longer fighting to become something, they were something. Imagine being there, watching the city step into history, no longer part of an empire, but part of something entirely new. This is Christchurch, known today as the Old North Church. Completed in 1723, decades before the American Revolution. Long before it became associated with famous signals and midnight rides, it stood as a familiar Anglican church in Boston's North End. The images we're looking at come from different moments. One attempts to recreate how the church and its surroundings would have appeared in the 18th century, while the other dates from probably 1807, showing the building as it stood in the early years of the New Republic. Together, they give us a sense of continuity, a structure that remained rooted in place as the world around it changed. Not long after these early years, this quiet church would be pulled into events far beyond its original purpose. From this tower came a simple signal, 2 lanterns, warning that British troops were moving by sea. What had once been a place of routine and worship suddenly became part of the larger story unfolding across the city. At the time, nothing about this spot would have suggested the role it was about to play. It was simply part of the neighborhood, woven into everyday life, unaware that it would soon be remembered as one of the places where everything began to shift. Now I want to bring you into the present and show how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have thoughts or requests for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. This engraving shows Boston's first meeting house from 1632, once standing along what is now State Street. What began as a quiet wooden building at the edge of a small settlement has since become one of Boston's busiest streets, with no visible trace of where the town first gathered. This 1723 view shows Boston as a low, crowded harbour town, shaped by the sea. Today, that same shoreline is filled, built up, and transformed into a modern skyline, but the harbour is still the city's heart. This image shows the original Boston Light as it appeared in the 1720s. That first lighthouse was later destroyed by British in 1776. What stands on this island today is a rebuild, completed in 1783. It remains the oldest continually used lighthouse site in America. This engraving shows Castle William in the early 1700s, guarding Boston Harbour for the British. Damaged during the British evacuation in 1776, it was later rebuilt by Americans. Its walls still stand today, overlooking a very different harbour. This engraving shows Harvard's early campus as it formed in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Of these buildings, only Massachusetts Hall still stands. Built in 1720, it survived the Revolution and remains the oldest building at Harvard still in use. Today, the old State House is still here, nearly unchanged, but now surrounded by modern towers. What was once the center of colonial power sits quietly inside a modern city, one of the few places where Boston's revolutionary past still stands in place. In 1768, the Boston Common was open grazing land and public ground, where people walked, trained, and gathered at the edge of a small town. Today, the same space remains Boston's oldest public park. No longer pasture, but still a shared commons, surrounded by a modern city that grew up around it. Faneuil Hall, as it appeared in 1775, when it was already a center of debate and protest on the eve of revolution. Today, the building still stands on the same spot, surrounded by crowds once again, no longer arguing independence, but carrying on the life of a city shaped by what happened here. The Old North Church still rises above the street, much as it did in the 1700s. The The city has closed in around it, but the church remains the same anchor. Once a quiet colonial landmark, it now stands surrounded by modern Boston, watching over the same streets where history first unfolded. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.